Hello, everyone. Welcome to Medicine and Miracles. I'm your host, Dr. Scott McMahon. Been a board-certified pediatrician for over 30 years, specialized in the diagnosis of CIRS for nearly 15 years. CIRS, or CIRS, is short for chronic inflammatory response syndrome. It's a mystery illness to many doctors, and it can affect any part of your body. I've evaluated 2,000 patients, published 10 articles, co-written a CIRS medical textbook. I've given 50 presentations at medical meetings and testified as an expert witness in 10 states and 2 other countries. But I'm also a man of faith, and I've followed Jesus for over 30 years. I'm an ordained minister. I've pastored a church. I've written a book on spiritual warfare, and I've been on 15 international medical or preaching mission trips. So this is Medicine and Miracles. We're going to talk some about medicine and science, but we're also going to talk about faith and some of the miracles that I've seen over the years. Some people think that medicine and faith are incompatible subjects, but I'm going to show you that that thinking is not true. Medicine, miracles. Medicine and miracles. Going to be great. So let's dive in. Today, we're going to discuss different building techniques of your home and different materials. And the topic is important for people who are building new or who have mold problems in their existing home, particularly if they suffer from a mold-based illness like CIRS. Now, I'm not an expert on this subject, but I still have a lot of knowledge. I'm going to give you some education, but this is not medical or building advice. And if you're thinking of building or you are building, make sure you speak with an expert in the field. Now, there are 3 main aspects that you have to concern yourself when you're building a new home. One is the foundation or the underneath part. One is the roof, or the part that's on the top. And then, of course, there's the interior and exterior. So different materials can be used in each one of these, and each has different pros, different cons, and different price points. So there are primarily 3 different ways to create a foundation. The first one is below grade. And when you do this, it creates a big hole in the ground that eventually becomes a basement. Now, basements can cause a lot of problems for people who are sensitive for mold. And the water and sewage pipes often run between the basement ceiling and the first floor. So basements can get wet. Basements can also get water in from the ground that's around them. And there are a number of ways for basements to have problems. In my experience, about 90% of the patients I've taken care of who have basements have basement problems with mold. A second way of building a foundation is called pier and beam. Now, in this, you place concrete footings. You pour them either on the level ground, or maybe you dig down a little bit, but not as much as if it's below grade and you have a basement. And then after those footings are solid, then you put beams across them and you build the house on top of the beams. And this creates a crawl space for people under their home. And like basements, these can also be problematic for moldy people. And here, the water and sewage pipes tend to run through the crawl space. So if they leak, you get a problem underneath. The final way that I'm going to mention is called a slab. And here, the concrete is poured on the leveled dirt. And there is no basement, and there is no crawl space. And typically, you've already put the water and sewage pipes, their runs will go through that, and then they hold in the concrete, but you already have the part that comes up. So like it can go through the floor and to where your toilet might be, for instance. Now, in the world of mold, we usually recommend not to do a crawl space or a basement if you're going to build new. We suggest a slab foundation, and that helps avoid a lot of problems that we can find in the basement or the crawl space. Now, as we move next to the roof, there are 3 types to consider that we're usually seen. One are called flat roofs, and these are flat, and they use a plastic or some form of rubberized membrane, and that can wear and tear. But they're relatively inexpensive, in part because you don't have to put all the infrastructure to create a pitched roof, and in part because it's just flat. But flat roofs leak. It's one of the first things I learned when I moved to New Mexico. The desert, flat roofs leak. Water can pool in places unless it's perfectly flat, which it usually isn't, and that can eventually lead to leaks. Flat roofs do not have attics. A roof leak is right. And so when that flat roof leaks, it often causes your ceiling to be wet or moldy. Now, the second kind of roof we call a pitched roof, and it looks kind of like this, or the classic A-frame that you might have seen on a cabin. And many houses, unless you're in Roswell, New Mexico, or somewhere in the Southwest where there's a lot of adobe, most houses have a pitched roof. And these are the ideal as long as the pitch is not so slight that the rainwater can't run off it. So if your pitch is like this, ooh, that's going to be hard to climb up. So most pitches are lower, but if it's a really low pitch like this, the water may not run off it, and then you can have problems with leaks. Now, pitched roofs typically create an attic space, and that attic will usually have insulation. So if your roof leaks, it causes mold on the insulation and maybe on the wood-beam members that are used to frame the roof. Last but not least, nowadays, or at least for the last 20 years or so, I've noticed a lot of really fancy, complex designs with roofs, with gables and multiple roof lines, and they look beautiful, but they're real expensive. And these often allow water pooling, ice damming in cold climates, and other things that can also lead to leaks into the insulation below. No matter what type of roof you have, they'll usually also have penetrations coming through them. That could be a chimney, or it could be vents from, say, your clothes dryer or things like that. Now, those vents, it's a good thing for them to come up and vent outside of your house and not into your attic. But wherever you have a penetration, it has to be properly sealed and or properly flashed. And I have seen so many people have problems where the flashing wasn't done right, or there was no flashing, and the water just leaks at that juxtaposition between the vent or the chimney and the roof, and that water leaks in and causes all sorts of problems, mold problems. So there you go. Make sure it's properly flashed or sealed. Finally, the middle of the house, under the roof, above the foundation, has an exterior and an interior. And actually, between those two surfaces, there's some infrastructure built also. Let's talk about the exterior facade first. This can be made by a bunch of different things: stucco, brick, wood, stone, and more. And each one of these has their own vulnerabilities to moisture. They have to be done right. If they're not done right, they'll create condensation or allow moisture into the other side of it, so where insulation might be, or to the interior wall. So the exterior of the walls themselves can be made from different materials. Now we're really talking about the center of the wall. So stick frame is probably the most common nowadays. It's inexpensive, and it uses wooden 2x4s, and they go up and down, and there's a top plate and a bottom plate, and they build the wall all at one with a stick, with these different studs that are usually 16-inch on center from in between. And you put insulation in between those studs. Now, another way of building that wall is concrete, cinder blocks, or adobe. And these are relatively inexpensive, but you need a really thick wall if you're going to have it insulate well. Some people, instead of using wooden studs, will use steel. They're stronger, they're more expensive, and you still have to put insulation in the wall. But the studs themselves, if they get wet, don't usually promote mold growth. Other people use plastic or rubber, which can off-gas for people who are chemically sensitive, and they can be expensive. Now, another method of building the walls is called rammed earth. And I like this one a lot. It is dirt mixed with a small amount of cement, and then it's rammed together with great force. And if you build your house out of this, it can last for hundreds of years. Now, it's more expensive, but you can also pass it down to your kids. It's relatively earthquake resistant. It's relatively flood resistant. It's fire resistant. I mean, these walls can't catch on fire. You can put insulation between the walls, and then it becomes incredibly energy efficient. And it can also absorb electromagnetic fields if you're sensitive to those. It can also absorb excess humidity if you're in a high humidity climate. So it really makes it difficult for mold to grow on the walls, and that's a plus. Now, regardless of what kind of walls you use, unless it's the concrete cinder blocks adobe, you typically run your electrical wires through those walls to the place where you need them, like the receptacles and whatnot. And then that brings us to the interior side of these exterior walls. And again, there typically are three different types. There's sheetrock, also called drywall, gypboard. It's basically a gypsum sandwich. Gypsum is a white chalky material, and then you put paper on the outside as the bread slices of the sandwich. You can paint these walls. You can texture them. If you're using it as a ceiling, you can put popcorn. Does anybody use popcorn anymore? Anyway, they're really inexpensive relative to other methods, but if they get wet and they're not dried out within 24 to 48 hours, mold loves to grow on wetted sheetrock. So another alternative is plaster and lathe. That's Lathe. Now, plaster and lathe uses a higher pH, and so it defends somewhat against mold. But actinobacteria, they like a higher pH, so it might promote that. It's also more expensive than sheetrock. If you're using plaster and lathe, you run a bunch of 1-inch furring strips, and then you basically put plaster of Paris over that. And so you need somebody who knows what they're doing. It takes a lot more time to do, but it can look very beautiful too. And you can still paint it if you want. And then last but not least, you have concrete and stone and rammed earth. And they don't even need a wall covering. You can put your nails for your pictures and whatnot right into the wall. And so that saves you a place where you can get mold in your house. And then, of course, there are multiple other decisions that you have to make, like windows and your HVAC systems and just so much, much more. But these are the basic building blocks and some of the materials that are used. Now, if you are building, make sure you do your research and work with professionals that know how to make houses relatively mold-free. And that will hopefully save you lots of problems. You can find lots of free videos about these kind of things at www.cirsx.com and a list of trained treating professionals at www.survivingmold. Now let's move into the miracle part, my favorite part. I started seeing CIRS patients in about 2010. And one of the first people that I saw was 49 years old, and she had spent her entire life in moldy buildings. Every school that she'd ever gone to, every home that she'd ever lived in or apartment, every place that she had had a job was moldy. And when I first met her, she told me on her good days, she used a walker to get around. And on her bad days, she was in a wheelchair. And on top of that, she had POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Basically, when she would stand up, she couldn't get enough blood to her brain fast enough, and she'd get ready to pass out, get lighthearted. So her heart rate to get that blood up there would go up to 220 beats a minute. And normal is about 60 to 100. So that's pretty high, and it's pretty unusual. Anyway, in addition to that, she had multiple chemical sensitivities, and different odors from different things like building materials that were new would make her sick. And not only that, but she couldn't tolerate even small doses of many of the medicines that her doctors wanted her to take. So to make a long story short, after about a year of treating her and just making little incremental steps, we had made some small improvements. Like now she could walk 75 feet without using a walker. And that was monumental, but it's not exactly a normal life. Another thing is like her heart rate would now only go up to 180 instead of 220 when she stood up. So better, but not normal. and she couldn't work. She had been declared disabled by SSDI. Now, she found through her own research a spiritual retreat that was run by a Catholic nun in the mountains around Vancouver, British Columbia. And she flew to Seattle in her wheelchair. Well, I mean, they used the wheelchair to get her on the airplane, but she took her wheelchair with her, and a friend picked her up in Seattle. Then they crossed the border, and she went to the retreat in her wheelchair. Now, again, this was in the mountains, so that's not terribly practical, but that's what she had to do. And during this retreat, one evening they had a campfire service. And this is where people sit around a campfire and whoever the leader is talks about spiritual things and helps people to kind of let go of bad things that have happened to them in the past, maybe even forgive people. And sure enough, that's what happened. This woman, my patient, actually forgave her ex-husband who had abandoned her and hurt her in many, many ways. And she also made the decision to no longer be afraid or to walk through life just filled with fear. She literally wrote these things down on a piece of paper. She crumpled them up and threw them into the campfire and watched them burn. So there's a symbolic in the throwing it into the fire and watching it burn up. It's symbolic of letting it go and being cleansed of this stuff. By the next morning, she was walking, jumping, and bounding in the mountains without any assistance. She got rid of all this junk, and her inability to walk without assistance was gone. When she returned, she left her wheelchair at the airport. Not only that, but when she came home, she went to one of the local 440-yard tracks, that high school students run. If they want to run the mile, they go around it 4 times. She went and called her friends and the news media, and I went too, and she walked that 440 track several times, documented by about 30 people. Pretty amazing. Thank you, Jesus. Now, I saw this woman just a couple weeks ago. I still treat her. It's 13 years later, and she still walks without assistance. Her POTS has disappeared as long as she remains well hydrated and stays out of mold exposures. She feels so much better. She went back to school and is now a health coach and has her own business. Glory to God. Just an amazing story. Hallelujah. So we never finish Medicine and Miracles episode without bringing an encouraging word, something that you can take into your day yourself. And today I chose one of my favorite verses, which is, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. If you're looking it up, it's in Philippians 4:13. And my God is the God of the impossible. There is nothing he can't do. So when times get tough for me, and they do, for instance, we had a huge flood in my city this week. We had record amounts of rainfall for a 24-hour period that fell in 5 to 6 hours. I saw videos of cars being washed down the road in currents. Tough times. And you know that you got tough times too. But when I get those tough times, I remember that I can do all things with him. He can do it himself. But sometimes he chooses to do the impossible things through people, like healing, like that patient I told you about who went to a spiritual retreat, and the Catholic nun showed her a pathway to let go of old anger and unforgiveness, and she had healing in her body as a result of that. So the tough times still come, but we walk through them together, and he never fails. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us. If you liked what you saw, make sure that you, or if you learned something new, make sure that you hit like and subscribe, and join us again for our next episode of Medicine and Miracles, where we find the mysteries of the human body intersecting with the unsearchable God. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye, and God bless you.